Pleasure today to introduce Andrew Barto with his talk on reinforcement learning. As you know, Andrew is a very well-known scientist in reinforcement learning. I think that everybody in our hackathon read his book. And today we will have a talk about some aspects of reinforcement learning, which is connected to intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning. It's about how to explore the world, how to gain information about the world in the most optimal way. So let's welcome Andrew on our hackathon.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mikhail. I wish I could see you all. It's a bit strange just to talk to my monitor. But I want to talk to you about intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning, something I've been interested in for a while. And I have to say, I retired about 4 years ago. And so this talk, based on material that was done quite a few years ago, it's not the latest that other people are doing, but I think it will give you enough sense of what this means and how interesting it is. I think it's very interesting, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about it. So the basic idea of what I want to do is just say a few things about reinforcement learning. Mikhail said that he wasn't sure that everyone knew about this, although most of you presumably know something about machine learning. So I want to do a very brief introduction to reinforcement learning. And then I'm going to turn to psychology and talk about motivation, and in particular intrinsic motivation from a historical point of view. And after that, I'm going to talk about it from a reinforcement learning point of view. And if we have time, provide a evolutionary perspective, which is a point of view that for me has sort of clarified what we really mean by intrinsic motivation. And then at the end, I will show you a film, I hope, if I get that far, that's kind of interesting, that deals with this subject. And so that's the plan. So let's get started. So presumably you all know about supervised learning, where training is done from a corpus of examples. And the examples give inputs together with labels or desired outputs. And many of these systems are error correcting, where the target and the actual output are compared to produce an error, for example, in neural networks and so on. And this can be used for regression, classification, prediction, many types of problems. So that's supervised learning. Reinforcement learning is a bit different in that instead of getting training information in the form of labeled examples, the training information consists of evaluations of what the system did, which could be thought of as rewards and penalties. And so the objective in this case is for the learning system to get as much reward as possible as it can over time by doing the right thing, by controlling its environment in order to produce reward. So to me, the way I think about reinforcement learning is that it's a combination of control, search, and memory, where control means that the system influences future events, future inputs. Search, trial and error, generate and test, variation and selection are various terms, but the idea is that the system has to try things and then have them evaluated in order to decide what to do next. And memory is important because the idea is that you really remember what worked best in various situations so that you can return to those actions the next time a similar situation occurs. So control, search, and memory, to me, are the basic elements of reinforcement learning. And now let me turn to a perspective from psychology and just connect this a little bit to what we know from psychological studies of learning. You all know of Pavlov, who studied the conditioned reflex, and this is Pavlovian or classical conditioning, and I think of this as being more closely related to supervised learning than it is to reinforcement learning, because the reflexes are built in and new information is learned in order to trigger them. And it's not exactly supervised learning, but it's closer to that than what Thorndike was doing, which led to the term trial and error learning, or instrumental or operant conditioning. And he studied cats and other animals. And in this case, he would put a cat into a puzzle box, and the cat really disliked being in a box, and it would flail around trying various things and eventually would find a way to escape. And he'd put it back in the box and it would escape more quickly, and eventually it would immediately do whatever manipulations were required for it to let itself out of the box. And so this is trial and error learning, not to be confused with error correction. Basically, the animal is trying things, and if it works, then it remembers that and does it again in future situations. So trial and error learning, or instrumental or operant conditioning, is basically what reinforcement learning is in the computational world that we deal with. So let me talk about motivation briefly from a psychological point of view. The basic idea of motivation is that well, there's a lot of disagreement about it, but often books will say it deals with forces that energize an organism to act and that direct its activity. And extrinsic motivation refers to being moved to do something due to some external reward, like a prize or a good grade or money or something like that, or praise. Whereas intrinsic motivation means being moved to do something because it's inherently enjoyable, doing things for their own sake. And people often say exploration, manipulation, play, maybe learning itself is enjoyable for its own sake. And these would be examples of intrinsically motivated behavior. And actually, this term goes back to 1950, a paper by Harlow, who created these mechanical puzzles with latches and hinges and various things. And he would allow monkeys to manipulate these kinds of devices, and he found that they would do this for hours at a time, not being hungry even. And so it seemed, in fact, they would ignore food and other activity because it seemed somehow to be intrinsically motivating to manipulate this type of mechanism. So he coined the term intrinsic motivation as a result of these experiments, and he wrote that there must be some kind of manipulation drive that animals have, or at least these monkeys have, that's strong and persistent, and that it accounts for the learning and maintenance of this puzzle performance. And then he said that these drives represent a form of motivation which may be as primary and as important as the homeostatic drives. And by that, he's referring to drives that were considered to be essential and primary just for the survival of the animal, and that this motivation to manipulate was on par with them. And it wasn't learned by an individual monkey, but was innate, like the more primary drives. So he also said, let's see, this I think you can read, but all this is saying is that he says that this kind of behavior appears very quickly, and so it's likely not learned, but is innate. And not because it predicted some more primary drive, but that it was built in and innate. And so this is kind of a key thing underlying some of the work with computational reinforcement learning that I'll get to shortly. So a little bit more from Berline. Did I mention Berline? Yes. So I should have prefaced that by saying that Daniel Berline, a psychologist, studied curiosity and intrinsic motivation of various forms very intensely in the 60s and 70s. And he wrote that this about extrinsic and intrinsic exploration. And let me just read this first one. The stimuli to which a subject gains access through extrinsic or exploration are sought only as cues for the guidance of some succeeding response with an independent source of biological value or reinforcement. The stimuli made available by intrinsic exploration are, in contrast, sufficient in themselves, regardless of their immediate practical value. So he's saying that that these are rewarding things to do, not for what they produce in the future, but the very act of doing them is rewarding in some way to the animal. And he coined two terms, ludic behavior. Ludic comes from the Latin meaning play. So this is really play, which psychologists have talked about a lot. What's the purpose of play? And but he says that this kind of behavior is, he defines as end behavior that does not have a biological function that's clearly recognizable. And then epistemic behavior is behavior that augments knowledge. Curiosity, exploration are examples of epistemic behavior. Oh, and this is another quote from Berline that I thought was interesting to us computer scientists, even though it goes way back to 1960. He says, until recently, little has been done to find out how animals behave, whether in the wild or captivity, when they have nothing particular to do. So in other words, if they're not engaged in solving some problem, they're not just sitting there doing nothing. So they're behaving according to intrinsic motivations. Anyway, I think this is relevant to computing as well. Most of the time our computers are not doing anything. They could be doing something with that during those times. Okay, so some key characteristics of intrinsic motivation, not accounted for by traditional biological or homeostatic drives like hunger, thirst, sex, pain, fear of pain, and so on. And they're not learned, but they're built in. Intrinsic reward is, we would say, it's primary, not secondary. Whereas if you know more about reinforcement learning, you know, a lot of it has to do with prediction of reward, where the predictions of the reward are themselves rewarding. And those would be called secondary rewards because they're learned by the learning agent. Whereas if we look at the psychology of this, the idea is that intrinsic rewards are built in, on par with basic rewards, hunger, thirst, sex, fear of pain, and so on. But they don't have clearly recognizable biological functions. And they're not in the service of achieving a specific goal. They're done for their own sake. So one view is that these intrinsically motivated behaviors do have biological utility, but it's not immediate. It's later on or over the entire lifetime of the animal. What's learned during exploration or what skills are learned during play are likely to be useful throughout life, and that the evolutionary process has built in mechanisms through the reward system to encourage animals to acquire these generally useful skills. Okay, so there's a lot of history of people sort of trying to describe what is intrinsically rewarding about various activities, and this is a list of them. Novelty, surprise. A lot of it hinges on surprise. Are the drive to control things, to make things happen, to master the environment, to make it do what you want it to do, and so on. So there are many different ideas that have been talked about in the past. And well, this slide is about basic research. In fact, I tend to think of intrinsically rewarded behavior as very much like basic research. It's not as if you're explicitly trying to create some technological device, but rather collecting knowledge that may or may not be useful. But you know, it turns out that a lot of the specific scientific and industrial achievements are built on a background of basic research that has uncovered primary knowledge about the world that can be used for practical applications. But the motive for doing basic research is to acquire knowledge, not necessarily to build a device. So I think there's thinking about basic research as analogous to intrinsically motivated behavior, I think is a valid thing to think about. All right, so connecting this to reinforcement learning, motivations about maximizing reward, it's not the whole story because motivation is more general than that. But from a reinforcement learning point of view, the reinforcement learning agents are motivated to get reward. And so to build RL systems that are intrinsically motivated is really a question of what kind of reward function should be used in such a learning situation. So let me talk a little bit about the basic reinforcement learning framework that I think is useful for thinking about this. And I'll just start by making a distinction between rewards and reward signals. So typically, rewards are thought of as objects or events in the environment that the system likes, will come back for more. And you know, something you give to a agent to reward it for something it did. The reward signals are inside in an animal, inside the brain, that are used for influencing brain activity related to behavior, so that external rewards, objects and so on, can give rise to reward signals in the brain. But reward signals in the brain can come from other things too. And that's what I want to emphasize in the next few slides, where the usual way to think about a reinforcement learning agent is that you have this agent interacting with an environment, it generates actions, and it receives state information and rewards coming from the environment. And often we use the term there's a critic within the environment that's looking at the actions and evaluating them, giving in the mathematical framework, giving a scalar real valued reward at each time step based on what the agent is doing. So let's refine this a bit to make connections that I think are really important to think about. And so split the environment into two parts. And One part's the external environment, where I mean now external to the animal or robot or organism that we're interested in. And then another part of the environment is actually internal to the agent, to the robot or animal. So in an animal, it's part of your nervous system and your body. A robot could be all sorts of mechanisms that, you know, the power supply and all of those things are internal to the robot. But from a reinforcement learning point of view, they're external to the reinforcement learning agent. So it's interacting, the agent now is interacting with an environment consisting of stuff internal to the organism and stuff external. And so in this framework, the primary critic is giving reward signals to the agent. So this would be something happening in the brain. The external environment is giving rewards in the sense of objects or other sensations to the organism. And so I think it's important for you to not regard the environment of a reinforcement learning agent as being something completely external to the device or robot or system that you're considering, because there can be many components that are within that system. I wish I could hear you and hope that this makes sense at this point.
We can ask, does it make sense? Anybody who has questions, or is it clear? Yeah.
Yeah, am I good?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right, let me go on then.
Yeah, great.
Now, here are some examples that I think are interesting of instances of intrinsically motivated, what we would call intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning. And an early example comes from Jürgen Schmidhuber, who wrote a paper called A Possibility for Implementing Curiosity and Boredom in Model Building Neural Controllers. And he had a whole bunch of tech reports back in the early 90s on this. And his idea was that the goal of curiosity and boredom is to improve a model of the environment, of the external environment, of the world, and that a curiosity unit uses a reward that is a function of the mismatch between the model's predictions and the actuality. So the system is making predictions, and a reward is based on the error, the prediction error. And he first considered that there's positive reinforcement whenever the system fails to correctly predict the environment, which seems strange, that a big error would be a positive reward, but it has an interesting effect. And actually later he changed this to the idea that the reward is based on changes in the prediction error. And oops, I thought I had another slide describing this, but you know, the idea of this is if the agent is making a lot of predictions, it will be rewarded for staying in that part of the environment so that it will improve its model. Whereas if it's in a part of the environment that it already knows, it's bored, it gets no reward because the errors are small. And the idea is that this would direct exploration, sort of like curiosity, you know, to experience things that you don't understand, because this allows you to build that understanding. And it would cause the system to avoid things that it already knows about, and that would be boredom. So this was a very interesting case of an intrinsically defined reward signal, because presumably this prediction system is within the robot, not in its external environment, and that these error signals actually, they're driving supervised learning to learn a model, but they're also rewarding the system or punishing it based on the magnitude of these errors. It's a very interesting idea. Another kind of curiosity is something that Rich Sutton talked about, and it's known as an exploration bonus. So, and this is an idea that you want to encourage the system to experience states that it hasn't experienced for a long time. And so you add to the usual reward a bonus that's based on the time since an action was last executed in that state. So the longer the time, the greater the bonus. And this makes the agent better at learning environment models, sort of similar to what Schmidhuber was talking about. And again, it's an example of an intrinsic reward because it's computed, within the agent or the robot or whatever term you would like to use. So those are two examples that can be thought of as computational analogs of intrinsic rewards. And there are lots of others that people have discussed over the years. There's quite a growing literature on this. And this just mentions some of them. Actually, the lads Gianluca Baldassare and Marco Maroli edited a book focusing on this topic that was published a few years ago, and has papers by most of these people on this subject. So if you're interested in this, that would be a good place to look. All right, so one consequence of this is that for a reinforcement learning system, the space of reward signals can be expanded to include all kinds of things that can depend on the robot's internal environment in addition to things in the external world. So things that keep track of the robot's history, memory, its current models, its current value functions, its current policy, and so on can all be used to generate reward signals in various kinds of ways. And it's tempting to think then that intrinsic reward signal is a signal that depends only on internal state components, but that's too simple because in many cases it depends on both internal and external signals. All right, let's see. I need to check the time. I want to switch to an evolutionary perspective, which is something that has helped me understand this a little bit better. And so it gets a little abstract here, and I'm hoping that you can stick with me as I go through this. This work was motivated by a paper in economics that called Information, Evolution, and Utility. And a quote from this paper says, "Given that successful descendants are the currency of evolutionary success, why do people have utility for anything else? So why do other things reward us and not just having successful descendants? Of course, what's needed to survive and reproduce are rewarding activities, but we also place utility on lots of other things too, and they wondered why this evolved, actually. And so we did some experiments on this, and this gets a little abstract, but I hope that you can stick with me on this. There are two papers that we did with Satinder Singh, who's at the University of Michigan, and Rick Lewis at the University of Michigan also. We did a conference paper called Where Do Rewards Come From? And then in another paper, together with Jonathan Sorg, who was a graduate student at Michigan at the time, Intrinsically Motivated Reinforcement Learning from an Evolutionary Perspective. And, I'm not so much interested in evolution here, but to me, it helps explain why an agent should have rewards for all kinds of things that don't necessarily seem to be beneficial, at least in the short term. So let's take a look at this. The basic setup is this. So you have an agent, an RL agent, call it A, and a space of reward functions. R, big R is the symbol for a whole collection of possible reward functions. And for each reward function, each of the reward function is a map from states to real numbers. So when the agent is experiencing an environmental state of a certain type, then the reward function will generate a reward that rewards the agent. And again, this state could include internal and external state components, as I had talked about before. Then there's an environment that the agent interacts with, and the environment changes states in response to actions and generates reward signals according to the reward function R. Now, so given a reward function, you can get a history, H, by running the agent interacting with the environment E given that reward function. So it's a learning agent. It's learning according to the reward function R in a specific environment. And then there's a fitness function that evaluates the whole history of the agent's behavior in that environment. And we use the term fitness function just in analogy to a evolutionary fitness function, which in evolution would be reproductive success. Here, it's more abstract than that. We really aren't doing any kind of genetic algorithm at all, but there's a reward function that rewards the agent during its lifetime, and then there's a fitness function different from the reward function that evaluates its performance over its entire lifetime. And then you can say, well, an optimal reward function is the reward function R star, such that when the agent learns according to that reward function, it's maximizing fitness. So there's two important functions here. There's a reward signal that is built into the learning agent, and then there's an overall fitness function that evaluates the entire lifetime of the agent's experience. That's a basic setup. I'm going to make it more complicated. Well, R star, the best reward function, depends on the agent, depends on the space of reward functions, and the environment. I'm going to make it more complicated. So stick with me here. Again, there's an agent, A.
Andrew,
so yes.
We have one question here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you go back for one slide, please? With the basics setup, yeah. So you're saying that the fitness function is, optimal reward function depends on the agent. How is that? How you formalize the agent here? So you have the reward function on the actions which agent is computing. And
Yeah.
And what is the agent here?
Well, the agent can be any reinforcement learning agent. So it's learning to try to maximize reward as given by a reward function. So that's its kind of a, you know, it's the usual reward function that we think of in reinforcement learning. And the agent is learning according to that. But over a whole history, there's another evaluation that says how good that whole behavior is. And that's different than the reward function. I mean, if you think of this in terms of biology, so we get rewards for eating and escaping and all sorts of things like that. But evolution is evaluating us by reproductive success over our lifetime. And those things are not the same, although our rewards that we get are instrumental in improving our fitness, which is why we have our reward systems in our nervous systems. Does that help?
Yeah, this helps. Thank you.
Okay. So they make it a little more complicated and actually a little more close to what happens in biology. There's an agent, there's a space of reward functions, but now there's a whole set of environments with a probability distribution over them. So we're not considering an agent in a single environment, but an agent that is facing environments that are sampled from this distribution. So given a reward function and an environment sampled from this distribution, you get a history. And then the fitness function, as before, evaluates that history. And now the optimal reward function is the reward function that maximizes the expected fitness over the distribution of environments. And this, as before, depends on the agent, the space of reward functions, and also on the distribution of environments. So this makes it a little complicated, a little more complicated. I'm going to give you an example that I hope will make this framework make sense. And here's an example. So we call this the boxes environment. So it's a grid world. The agent is the circle in the middle. It can move north, south, east, and west. It can't move through the dark, bold barriers in the grid world. And the agent has a bunch of actions, and the state now that the agent gets has 6 dimensions, the XY coordinates of the agent, and a hunger status. It's either hungry or not hungry. And then it has information about the boxes. It knows whether box 1 is open or closed, and whether box 2 is open or closed. And then it knows if it's in the same space as food. So it's just a toy example, but we created this to just look at some issues about reward functions. So the actions, as I said, move north, south, east, or west. It can open a box if it's at the box. If it's right on the same square as a box, it can open it. And it can eat. That if it executes the eat action, it doesn't do anything unless the agent is at an open box that has food in it. So it's just a kind of toy example. Let's go a little bit more detail. So remember, there's a whole set of environments, and there's a probability distribution over them. And certain features are fixed in all those environments. Namely, there are always 2 boxes. It's always the case that a closed box always contains food, which escapes when the box is open unless the agent eats it immediately. So I've shown this as a mosquito that's flying away. So if the agent's at a box and the box is open, it can eat. And when the agent consumes food, becomes not hungry for one time step, and fitness is incremented. So fitness is going to be the total amount of food the agent eats over its lifetime. And, you know, it's just a pretend thing. It's not reproductive success, but something just much simpler than that that we can deal with in these little simulations. And then an open box is closed with certain probabilities at each time step. And over the different environments in the distribution, everything stays the same, except the boxes move around. Different environments have the boxes in different places. And so, you know, a good reward function is not going to award going to a place, because that's going to be different across all of these environments. But it has to reward something else. So fitness, as I said, is the total amount of food eaten over a lifetime. And the space of reward functions, we just did a finite space, all mappings from the states to a discretized range within the interval -1 and 1. And overall, there were 54,000 reward functions, and we could exhaustively search the space. So we're not doing anything fancy, but just, you know, having agents learn for each of these reward functions. And there are 3 types of reward functions in this space. One type we called simple fitness-based reward functions. And this is positive reward for events that increment fitness and 0 otherwise. So this is just rewarding the agent when it eats something. And that's directly related to fitness, because fitness is the total amount of food the agent eats over its lifetime. Now, a little bit removed from that is a fitness-based reward function where for events that increment fitness, there's one number, and for other events, there's another number. So this is similar, except instead of saying 0 and a positive reward, we just have 2 arbitrary numbers. And then there are other ones that are unconstrained, except they still have to yield numbers within that -1 +1 interval. So you might think that rewarding just based on eating is the best reward signal, but it turns out that that's not quite true. And we ran 2 conditions, and what I'm going to talk about is the step condition, because it relates to intrinsic reward. Each lifetime, in this case, is 20,000 steps, and we're going to set it up so that food only appears in the last 10,000 steps. So in the first 10,000 steps, there's no possibility for incrementing fitness. So pure fitness-based reward signal is not going to reward the agent at all. But other reward signals can reward it for doing other things during this period. And so here's some results from this. So you can see, so on the x-axis is the lifetime, and the first half of it, there's no food. And what we're plotting is the fitness, cumulative fitness. And so there's no increase in fitness because there's no food. But when food appears at this step, different reward signals give different levels of increasing fitness. So the steeper the line, it means that the agent is accruing fitness more rapidly than lower sloped lines. So in the best reward signal in that whole, the best reward function in that whole class of functions, it yields this quite rapid increase in fitness, whereas the best fitness-based reward is much lower. And the simple one, this is the one that just rewards eating, you see it increases, but not as rapidly as another reward signal. So what is that reward signal rewarding for the agent? It's not just food, it's some other activity. And I am presenting this just because I think these other activities are very much like intrinsically motivated activities, because they don't have direct benefit in terms of the overall fitness. And in particular, this is hard to understand, but the bottom line really is that the agent is rewarded for opening boxes throughout its life. And these are the specific numbers that come up in this search that we did. But basically means that the agent learns in this period where there's no food at all, it's intrinsically motivated to open boxes. So it's like playing with boxes and learns to open them. And you can see that the growth in the times when both boxes are open grows quite rapidly with this best reward signal, whereas for the other ones, it's very minimal. So I'm just presenting this because I think it's a good way to understand what intrinsically motivated behavior is. It is beneficial over the lifetime of the agent, but it's hard sometimes to understand what its immediate benefit is. Its benefit is something that is going to appear later on when opportunity arises. And so in this case, just playing with boxes without any kind of food at all is learns a skill that pays off greatly when food does occur. So a little bit abstract, and if you look at those papers, you can see some more details. And there's some other environments and lots of other things we can say, but the one thing to think about is that we're using these two functions to evaluate behavior. One is an immediate reward that the system learns according to, and the other is a lifetime evaluation, which is analogous to the evolutionary success of an animal. And so evolution provides animals with reward signals that allow fitness to be large from an evolutionary point of view. All right, so what does this suggest about motivation? Primary reward signals encourage behavior that has conferred fitness benefits throughout evolutionary history. And I think of this sort of behavior as behavior that's ubiquitously useful. It's useful across many possible environments. It does include classic biological drives like eating and sex and so on, but can also encourage other kinds of behavior. And these kinds of behaviors, I think, is what we call intrinsically motivated. Berline would call them ludic behaviors because their benefit to the biological benefit is something that is not immediately apparent from opening boxes. What does that mean? Well, it's a function of the environments that the agents have to live in. Okay, so let's get now. So, Mikhail, what time is it? How much time do I have?
Go ahead.
Okay, I've lost track. In fact, I can't see my clock here. All right, so
we still have some time for you. Say 15 minutes. It's okay.
Okay, all right, that's good. So let's look at this. Is a little more concrete from a artificial intelligence point of view. It's about skills and hierarchical reinforcement learning. So a skill is the ability to do something well, and my interest in intrinsically motivated behavior is that I think it's the means for learning a collection of reusable skills that can be used as building blocks for behavior and behavioral exploration. And so it relates to hierarchical reinforcement learning. So in reinforcement learning, the agent has a set of actions. But in hierarchical reinforcement learning agent, some of these actions are like macros that you can execute a particular high-level action, and it can generate a whole sequence of lower-level actions by the agent. So the system, in effect, can solve subproblems via these macros that can contribute to solving some overall problem. And each subproblem is itself a reinforcement learning problem that can be learned, but according to what I would think of as an intrinsic reward signal. So a framework for doing this, there are a number of frameworks for doing hierarchical reinforcement learning, but one of them is called the options framework that was proposed quite a while ago. And I'm not going to go into details of this, except, a canonical example is another grid world with walls and doors. And the idea here, if the basic agent just can go north, south, east, or west, if an agent has these sub-skills, for example, go to the nearest doorway, so these things labeled O's are examples of skills. They're actually policies that will take the agent to the nearest door, to a doorway. Then if the agent plans and learns using these higher level actions, it can learn much faster in this environment. So it's, instead of dealing with the basic low level actions, you can have these macro, they're not exactly macros because they're actually policies, which means that they're not just sequences of actions, they're actually mappings, functions from states to actions. So in this case, the policy is the O2 will be a policy that takes you to this door from wherever you are. And O1 is a policy that takes you to this door from wherever you are in this square. So if the system is working at this higher level, in many cases it can proceed much more rapidly and so on. Options aren't guaranteed to improve things, but in many cases they can, if they're useful, if they're the right options. So I want to now talk about an example that caused me to be interested in intrinsic motivation as a solution to the problem of trying to discover options or these macros that are useful to solve problems. And this goes back to Oliver Selfridge, who was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence. And he came up with this little example of a learning system that learned how to count. And so the idea is that you have, in this case, a bunch of birds sitting on a wire, and the system has a pointer, and it can move the pointer left or right. And the idea is the system should learn how to count these birds. And it does this because there's a counter in one of its actions. So one action is to move the pointer one bird left, another to move it one bird right, another is to increment the counter, add one to it, another is to decrement it. And so with these these are the primitive actions, the system is supposed to learn how to count the birds, which means eventually getting the number of birds on the counter. And so this is what Selfridge suggested, although it's simplified a bit. First, generate all programs of length 5 using the primitive actions. Execute each one. Now there's a halting mechanism, I'm skipping that, but after each halts, ask the human who's observing the system, was that interesting? And if you say yes, it says, would you like to give it a name? And if it's named, then that whole length 5 program gets placed among the primitive capabilities, along with the other primitive actions. And then the next step is to generate all length 5 programs, where now some of these instructions are these previously found interesting instructions. And this builds up hierarchically a program that learns to count. And it does it quite rapidly. But it's using you to answer this question, was that interesting? And so a hierarchical reinforcement learning system, unless it's already given all of the macros or these higher level actions that it's going to use, it needs a mechanism that's analogous to this, that can answer this question, was that interesting? And to me, that is a primary function for an intrinsic reward signal that just looks at these particular consequences and judges them whether they're interesting or not, in a way that's not necessarily knowledgeable about the overall task at all. So it's kind of like opening boxes in that little grid world. In some sense, opening boxes is interesting, and so the system should learn how to open boxes. Okay, so whoops, let's see. I don't know if you're with me, but there's a nice little movie here that yeah, go ahead, Mikhail.
Yeah, we are with you, so just keep going.
What? I'm sorry, I missed that.
We are with you, so just...
Oh, okay, all right, good. So let me finish up here pretty much. And this is a film that George Konondaris and Scott Kundersma did when they were graduate students at the University of Massachusetts. George is now assistant professor at Brown University, and Scott is assistant professor at Harvard. And they're both directing robotics laboratories. They made this film, actually won the prize, Best Student Video, 2011. So it's quite a few years old. They're those guys in their younger days. And this video illustrates some of these things that I've been talking about. So let me run this. I hope it works. Let's see.
Yeah. But is this robot was 5 years ago? This one with running on wheels?
Yeah.
Because it looks like very similar to recent robot from Boston Dynamics.
Oh, no, yeah, oh, that's right. I've seen a Boston Dynamics wheeled robot. No, this was quite a bit earlier than that. Yeah. And that robot has its wheels on the end of legs, right? That can articulate. This is just it's more like a Segway.
Yeah.
Okay, let me move this along a little bit. Okay, here we go.
So the task is given by picture, and solution is choosing another.
Sorry, what?
So the task is given by the picture, and the solution should be to finding another picture on the wall by following some path in the labyrinth.
Well, it should explain what the task is. It uses these pictures for the vision system. It's using off-the-shelf, very simple vision. So the point of it is really how it learns skills and uses them to solve related problems more quickly. So I think the film should explain this. I lost it.
Yeah. Is there any sound in this video? Because we see just a video without any sound.
Oh, you don't hear the sound.
Yes.
Oh, you have to hear the sound. How, let's see, what am I not doing correctly? I don't.
Maybe you should go to the window with the Hangouts and change from the sound source from the mic to your sound card.
I'm not sure what to do. I can use my microphone. Let's try that. Let me try. Let's see. I will put my microphone up to my computer's speaker. How about that?
Yeah.
Let's try that. That's not going to work either. That's not going to work either. That's not going to work. Because I can't use both the speaker and my microphone at the same time.
So can you just comment on the video and it's
okay, I will narrate it as it goes. I'm sorry. So the idea is an agent that can learn, can accumulate knowledge about how to do things to learn at a high level. It acquires skills and then uses those skills to solve a second task, a different task, but uses those same skills. This is not going to work. I can't really talk and hear it at the same time. You know, you can access this video. I guess I would invite you to, any people there who would like to see this could go to the website of either George, I think George Conandaris will have this linked to his site, and you can see this video. The basic idea is that this that it illustrates acquiring skills and treating them as primitives for learning another task that involves the same skills but used in different ways. And so instead of learning with just basic primitive actions in the second task, it can learn much more rapidly because it has already built a collection of skills, and it uses them hierarchically to learn in a different environment. And so it illustrates on a physical robot that acquiring a collection of skills that can be reused in different configurations can vastly improve learning in related tasks. And they're not explicitly using an intrinsic reward function for this, but it's the same idea as using intrinsic rewards to allow an agent to learn skills that may not be useful immediately, but that over the long term can be used in different ways in many different tasks in order to achieve goals that come up later. So, you know, there are lots of open questions. Many people are working on similar kinds of things. I guess the overall topic is hierarchical reinforcement learning. A framework that's widely used is the options framework, which I mentioned here. There's a 1999 paper by Sutton, Prakoop, and Singh, which introduces this options framework. And each option has its own reward function. And then the question is, where do those come from? And so I'm suggesting that they are analogous to intrinsic rewards that are built in to detect, you know, from this example, to detect things that are just interesting from any point of view, you know, what's interesting, and then learning skills to make these interesting things happen. And then if interestingness is defined in an appropriate way, the skills that are learned in that way should be useful later on for doing other tasks much more rapidly than would be possible if you were using low-level primitive actions. So yeah, I invite you to try to see that film. It's relatively old, and things have proceeded quite a long way since then, but it's a nice little film. So the idea of doing something for its own sake, what does that mean? It means not in the service of achieving some specific separable goal, not towards a goal that was presented or imposed from the outside. Serves to acquire knowledge or skills that are useful later on, related to what has been called epistemic behavior and ludic behavior. And I write here a continuum because I don't think there's a hard and fast distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. So I'm going to stop here. I want to thank a lot of people, Satinder Singh at Michigan, Rick Lewis, George and Scott, who made that film, which I hope you can see at some point, members of the Autonomous Learning Laboratory. I used to be co-director of that, but since I retired about 4 years ago, and so I don't have any more graduate students, and I'm not directing that lab anymore. Then I want to thank Gianluca Baldassare and Marco Miroli and other members of the I Am Clever project that I was involved in, directed by Gianluca and Marco in Rome, dealing exactly with this intrinsic motivation idea. Various funding agencies. And finally, I just use this to emphasize that rewards tend to be objects in the environment. It's how psychologists think of a reward, whereas reward signals are something in the brain. And in reinforcement learning, the R that we use as a reward is actually best thought of as a reward signal, because it can depend on all kinds of things that are internal to the agent and not just external. So thanks to Will Dabney, who did this little photoshopping of this Michelangelo. So that is all I planned to say, and I hope some of that made sense. You know, I think there are lots of opportunities for pursuing this, both in terms of biology and evolutionary theory, but in terms of artificial intelligence, because hierarchical reinforcement learning systems, that's a major way of dealing with the complexity of the kinds of problems that you'd like, say, household robots to be able to deal with. So anyway, I wish I could see you, but I'm open to some questions if you have any, and I do invite you to look at some of these publications if you would like to find out more. So thanks very much. And are there questions?
Surely, I think.
Let's see. Can I? Is there a way for me to see?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Let me. Yeah. Okay. Can you see me?
Not.
No. Okay.
You should stop sharing the screen.
Okay. Let me get rid of that.
Just
Stop.
stop. Yes.
Stop. I should stop sharing.
Yes.
All right.
So now we can see you.
Oh, there I am. Okay.
So questions.
Oh, it's a delay. That's interesting.
Hi, Andrew.
Yes.
Vitaly Dunin-Barkovsky. My lecture is next to yours, but it will be in Russian because everybody here speaks Russian. So on the slides are in English. First of all, are these publications available at your website or elsewhere? What you cited?
They are linked
Available, yeah. Okay.
to my website. If you go to my website and publications, you should be able to find,
Okay.
I think, all of them.
And more question. You see, all things which you have told us are extremely interesting and important, and they are extremely important for artificial general intelligent systems, I guess. Do you know any real steps in direction of composing this system of artificial general intelligence?
I'm not quite sure. For composing such systems?
No, but making system which have artificial general intelligence, just intelligence not worse than.
Yes. Well, I know people are interested in that, but I don't know the state of the art. I'm sure some progress has been made, but in fact, I mean, the most concrete work that I've heard of is on general game playing, where systems, you know, it's in a game playing framework, but the game can be any game, for example. Yeah, very good question. I'm sorry that I'm just not up to date on what's being done in that area, although I know people are very interested in that.
And sorry, one private question. You are younger than me, but you told you are retired.
Well, I'm 69 years old.
Yeah, I'm 77.
Oh, I am younger than you. Okay.
Was it voluntary or some circumstances?
No, I was very happy to retire.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I don't have to teach classrooms. I don't have to go to meetings. And you know what I've been doing since I retired is working on a second edition of the reinforcement learning book, working with Rich Sutton, and we're almost ready to deliver it to MIT Press. In fact, you can find a draft on the web of the second edition. If you go to my website and click on a picture of the book, it'll take you to a website that has a draft of the second edition, although I wasn't too happy about posting that because it's not quite where I want it to be. But certainly it's available. That's what I've been doing. But I was chair of the department for 4 years, and that was an exhausting experience. And I was happy to retire to avoid many of those distractions, as I should say. So it was entirely voluntary. Plus the retirement system that the state of Massachusetts has makes it economically feasible, in fact, attractive to do that. So.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question about relation of intrinsic motivation and the options framework, because a couple of days ago we have a talk of Doina Prekap.
Oh, good, yeah.
So we have a picture of the state of the art in the options framework, and at the moment there is a problem with defining sub goals for options. So in options we have initiation set and termination set. And the problem is that we have no good methods to find these sets to split our behavior on some skills or some sub goals. And it seems that this combination of some external fitness function with intrinsic motivation, it seems like a bit one of the solution for the problem. So you can have rewards for the termination set for every option, and then your agent will be able to learn the whole option given the reward at the end of the behavior of the skill. And you can set these rewards by evolutionary algorithm or maybe by another optimization technique.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think Doina probably called these pseudo rewards. I don't know if she used that term, but that's the problem that motivated my interest in intrinsic motivation, because in biology, I think our exploration and play and so on actually is useful for learning skills or options that we can use later on in various combinations. I mean, to me, that very problem is what made me interested in this whole subject of intrinsic motivation. And I was interested in looking at the psychology of it because people have studied this very intensively. And now you know that this connection to neuroscience that we have, that the TD errors related to dopamine signals suggests that during play and other kinds of behavior like that, there should be bursts of dopamine that, and there are some cases that where that has actually been verified experimentally. So I think the problem you just described is what made me interested in this subject of intrinsic motivation. And it's one of many other possibilities. I don't think it's necessarily the only way to tackle this problem, but a key thing is having these two, or this higher level fitness evaluation without necessarily doing genetic programming, but there's a lifetime evaluation and there's a local evaluation. And an interesting thing, I didn't really focus on this here, but Well, there's a interesting consequences that, when you give a reward function to a reinforcement learning agent, you're really specifying its goal. It's to maximize that signal. Now, you as the designer of the system may have another goal. In other words, your goal as a system designer need not be the same as the agent's goal. And the thing that makes this interesting is because the agent's bounded. It'll have a limited lifetime. It will have finite have limited memory and other resources. If it were unbounded and the amount of time it could learn was unbounded, then the fitness function should be the reward function. But since it's bounded, you can design a reward function that'll make it behave better given its constraints. So that's a subtle point that there are some papers on that also. Although I'm not an author on some of them, I can send you the reference to a thesis that was written by one of Satinder Singh's students at Michigan, who now works at Facebook, doing something else.
I also think that maybe your model with this sampling of different environments during agent lifetime, maybe it's like a very natural setting of the problem. Because what we've seen from the talk of Doina Prekap, we've seen that she said that actually for an MDP environment, options are not needed because you always have only single optimal strategy and you can derive it without any options. But I think that maybe the value of options for the case when you have such kind of problem settings, when you have different alternative environments.
Yeah.
Combine knowledge and transfer knowledge between them.
Yeah, I agree. I think to think about whole sets of environments, not single environments, is the earlier question about general intelligence. I think that's an essential component of general intelligence to have distributions over different environments. So I think that's very important.
One more question.
Andrew, one short question. Your robots were working in real environments. Why do you think it is important?
What to use
robots in the movie were acting in an environment. Why do you think it is important in physical environment?
Well, it makes the task much more complicated, and it's there's noise in the sensors. The dynamics of actually not my robot, I should say, that was a colleague's robot, Rod Gruppen at University of Massachusetts. But the dynamics, there's friction and wear and noise and so on, and it's a much more stringent test of the algorithms. Plus, in applying these types of systems to the real world, all of these complexities need to be considered. So I think there's a strong motivation to use these algorithms in real world problems.
Okay, let's thank you, Andrew, for the exciting talk and very deep ideas. And we will just thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for this opportunity. Bye-bye.